Bob, we normally carry on this dialogue in a fairly autonomous way, free of references to anything going on. We're not journalists here, we're interlocutors at a high level of abstraction and concretion. But I did go along to an exhibition recently, and I thought it made me think of some of our dialogue, so I thought I'd tell you about it and see what you had to say. The exhibition...
Excellent.
Yeah, is that a good idea?
That's excellent. I'd love to hear about it. I wish I was there.
Well, I went along to Tate Modern here in London, and maybe I should explain to non-London listeners that Tate Modern has been a great success, along with Brit Art, Damien Hirst and all those. It's kind of put modern art on the map and made it a popular thing. It's in an old power station, which is across on the other side of the Thames from St Paul's Cathedral. A pedestrian bridge was built across in the year 2000 called Millennium Bridge, which allows people who are visiting St Paul's and the city simply to walk over this bridge and suddenly they're in Southwark, in a completely different part of London, or always felt like a different part of London until this connection was made. And the old power station, which used to burn coal to create electricity for use of Londoners, has now been invaded by the Tate. And the Tate used to be a mixture of British art and modern art. Now the British art has been left in a backwater back at the old Tate Gallery, and the new Tate is this vast space, and artists are asked to fill this space. They call it the engine room, the machine room, something like that, and they have to try and use it. And there was an exhibition there of Futurism, the early 20th century movement in Italian art, and it was an unusual exhibition because it didn't simply have paintings by the Futurists. It had paintings by all the people who went to hear the spokesman for the Futurists, who was an extremely flamboyant and noisy character called Marinetti, in different capitals, Paris, London, Moscow, for example, and then painted responses. And so it was like a tour of early modern art movements that came as a response to the Futurists. And naturally it made me think about our discussions, because we're talking about the ideas of Karl Marx and Marshall McLuhan over the oeuvre of Frank Zappa. And one of the things that unites us, despite my scepticism about some of McLuhan's ideas, is the fact that McLuhan began his intellectual life in many ways thinking about Windam Lewis. And Windam Lewis was one of the prime respondents to Futurism. His vorticism was kind of invented as a reply to Marinetti's Futurism. And I wanted to talk to you about what I observed from the point of view of these programs, because the reason I think that we're talking, and I always have to say I think because I never quite know what you think, Bob. I mean, these dialogues are the longest we've talked together, aren't they? I mean, we've talked in the open. We haven't had many conversations behind closed doors and worked out everything we think before we do these dialogues. We're doing it in public, isn't that right?
Yes, and we don't really know each other.
Exactly. We know each other in the same way that people listening to us might get to know us. And
the last thing, our last personal encounter a year ago in April 2008, our last moment together, I said to you, the revolution has begun, and you shook my hand. That's my last memory of interaction with your chemical body.
I'm so glad. I have no recollection of that whatsoever myself, so I'm very glad that you've been a prosthetic memory and brought that back in. In fact, the image is a little bit harder than if I'd remembered it myself. And going around this exhibition, I thought about the reason what we say is different from most radio programs I tune into randomly. And I think it's probably that most radio, most publishing accepts a niche. It accepts an area where we're the experts on this and we'll speak about that, and if you want to know about this you can come over here. And we resist that. We keep plunging into areas which we shouldn't talk about, or which we don't really have a field of expertise. And this is very inspired by Frank Zappa, who similarly didn't really allow himself to be put in one position. You know, that if he's interviewed on Radio 1 as a pop person, he immediately starts talking about Anton Webern, an obscure classical composer that most pop people have never heard of. And but then when he's asked to explain why
when he's on a classical station, he'll talk about
R&B.
Muddy Waters.
Yeah, and I was thinking about trying to explain to people why we have this attitude, and seeing how Marinetti behaved, what he was doing. He was a rich man. He could do things like buy the front page of a daily newspaper in Paris to put his manifesto on it. So he was aware of the power of money. He used it, and the power of advertising. But what he was doing was making art jump out of its niche. He decided that, what he was doing appeared in some ways to be an attack on art, because he was saying, and it's typical for an Italian, because poor old Italians do feel very buried under the art of the Renaissance. That's the time when their country was preeminent. All the other countries in Europe copied them. The big thing in Elizabethan England was getting hold of the latest sonnets from Florence or Rome and poring over the new discoveries about the classical world being made in the Renaissance. That was the hip place in that period. And the Italians kind of suffer from this, because everybody who comes to Italy wants to go see the old paintings and the old statues and the old buildings. And so it was quite natural at the beginning of the Italian Industrial Revolution, when things were moving in Italy, the artist should suddenly have a reaction against all the old brown paintings and say, no, the motor car is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace. And he's talking about some old classical painting that we want to clear out and throw away and so on. So they were totally for the new. So it might seem like it's an attack on art, that it's calling for art to change. But if you look at what he actually did, what he did was intervene in the mass media. And I think he created a dialectic between modern art, or art reconceived as modern, and the mass media. He didn't do what the postmodernists say should be done, which is you kill art and say, well, the mass media is the new art. We're now in the epoch of mass media. That's what should, in the old days you'd do a painting. Now you must make a video. He didn't do it like that. He supported people doing paintings, but the paintings had to be completely different, and then he spoke about them in newspapers. So art kind of sprung out of its niche and became an attack and a criticism of the mass media, even though he was using the mass media to argue for it. And so he created something which wasn't satisfied with either niche. And I think as Zappa fans, we're pursuing that particular line in a way which can explain why so many people find that what we're talking about incomprehensible, because they can't see where we are, but where we are is critical. Do you follow any of what I'm saying? What would you have said to me if we were walking through this exhibition and I said that to you?
Oh, I think that's what I would think. It reminds me of a new PhD, a friend of mine named Shoki, who's coming out of the Rosalind Krauss Department of Art Criticism at Columbia, but she's in the Department of Architecture because of a problem with Krauss 10 years ago. And she's an interesting young thinker, and she's Dutch. But her thesis, a big part of it, is the art. She wants to correct art history criticism. In the last 40 years, she says, there's been a debate between those that work with media as artists and those who do traditional arts.
So that would be like up until pop art, abstract expressionism and so on was all about the picture plane. Clement Greenberg was the great theorist of that, about the flat picture surface. If you're going to do a painting, it's a flat thing. Let's not have all this stuff with illusion. Let's deal with the picture plane. And then suddenly pop art came along and said, stuff all this. You're not noticing what's going on in magazines and what's Coca-Cola bottles and all this. And so we had this stark divide, and some people date postmodernism with that divide, that if you support the abstract expressionists and free jazz and that kind of thing, then you're a boring old modernist. But if you like pop art and things that happened introducing pop music into classical music, crossovers and so on, blends, fusions, then you're a postmodernist. Yeah?
Exactly. One of her main chapters is Clement Greenberg versus Marsh McLuhan. And she says Greenberg was the king of art theory, art criticism in the 50s and 60s, and then was toppled partly by Rosalind Krauss with October magazine. But she says there was a whole other part of the debate that never made it into the academic histories or anything, and that was McLuhan's ongoing argument with Greenberg, which nobody knew about. McLuhan would refer to it like Windam Lewis. He would not name his enemy immediately. He would have he'd do it through red herrings, but who he's really targeting. So she says that the art criticism is missing the problem over what media is. What is the medium? And you have the Greenberg definition of medium, updated by Rosalind Krauss, and then you have the McLuhan definition of medium. And that's exactly what you were saying, and it sounds like Marinetti was on the Greenberg side. Use the old arts, but make them relevant somehow.
No, I don't think so. I think that's my interpretation of Marinetti. I think Marinetti influenced Lewis, who influenced McLuhan, and what he got from that line of avant-garde thinking was a refusal to get bound by either side. It's a decision that art should be an intervention, which it cannot be characterized as being one or the other. At least that's the liveliest part of Marinetti, the best part of Marinetti, a frustration with how art is characterized and perceived, a wanting it to leap out. And so I think let me just respond to that. No, that's exactly what Shoki says, that McLuhan played both sides more than Greenberg, and she kind of favors Kittler. She sets up Kittler against Krauss, and she solved the problem by doing the McLuhan method. She may not be say that specifically in the thesis. She kind of does. I haven't read it all yet, but that the ambiguity, the working, the frustrating both levels is the Menippean movement as McLuhan defined it, and Lewis was an exemplar of that. Joyce was, Zappa was, McLuhan himself was, and Shoki recognizes this. And yes, and that's what we are. And I'd like to develop, before I'm really keen to read this thesis, and I will do some behind-the-scenes work, thus contradicting how I open this show, saying that we don't do working things out behind the scenes. I want to read this thesis, and I'm a little embarrassed to be having this chat where I'm admitting I don't know something, I haven't done my research yet. But I want to develop an idea which may be killed by actually reading the thesis, but which I want to develop now, which is a guess, and also an expression of something I've been feeling for a long time and I've found very hard to articulate, which is, I came up with the new art history. I followed a girlfriend to Leeds to listen to T.J. Clarke and Griselda Pollock, who taught, and I was what they call a tosher, what they used to call a tosher in the 19th century, or a para-academic these days. I was hanging around the university. I wasn't officially there, but I'd talk to everybody in the pub. I'd go to the odd lecture. I was aware of what everybody was talking about. And I was very...
you had already graduated from Cambridge.
That's right, and dropped out and become a punk, and now I was hanging around in Leeds, imbibing the new art history. And we were promised it was going to solve the contradiction between art and Marxism, between economics and aesthetics, between studying art and changing the world. It was the key to everything. The Mekons and the Gang of Four and the Delta Five came out of this sort of ferment. And I went there to study the new art history. And Clement Greenberg was one of the people that were talked about, and what they researched was the political background to Clement Greenberg. So one was very aware that he was an ex-Trotskyist, that he had Marxism, and Clement Greenberg's ideas were all kind of understood as part of a kind of intellectual Marxism and talking about art, which I still felt had an element of elitism in it that I didn't like. And I found it very hard to put my finger on it, because officially he's a Marxist, he wants to change the world, he's talking about art. And I realise now that maybe the missing part, that the bit that I was frustrated by, that I couldn't find, was this discussion with McLuhan, because it seems obvious, talking to you, that the way McLuhan develops his ideas, someone like Frank Zappa is absolutely doing the right thing. He's doing something you can appreciate. But all these people couldn't appreciate Frank Zappa at all. I used to play it to them. I used to enthuse about the records. They'd come round to my house, we'd drink my home brew. I'd play them Frank Zappa. And they're all kind of like, why is Ben going on about Frank Zappa? And because it wouldn't lead towards certification in the academy and the particular project that T.J. Clarke and Griselda Pollock and these people were developing, it couldn't fit into it because it had a relationship to the mass media and to popular form, and that was somehow not on, even though a lot of these people were involved with rock music and punk, paradoxically. I mean, the Gang of Four and the Mekons were saying, let's do pop music and let's reach out, but Zappa was out of discussion because he was an old hippie and had long hair and it wasn't punk, and that was a watershed that I wanted to criticise because I thought that if we were locked in these fashion changes, we'd never be able to be critical about punk because we'd spend our whole time burning the old hippie stuff and then celebrating any nonsense under the name of punk, and I wanted something critical. And those two things put me right outside. I was the enemy. I was going around in my out-to-lunch raincoat being the one everybody hated because I wouldn't join in this non-Zappological relationship between the popular and fine art. So what do you think, Bob? Do you think punk has a relationship between the popular and the critical, or do you think it's a diversion? Do you stand with Frank Zappa's put-downs of punk?
Well, it's interesting. I recall Zappa saying that people suspect me having sympathy with punk because I obviously Freak Out had a punk aesthetic, a garage band aesthetic, and but then he would say, but I don't think putting pins in your cheeks and wearing garbage bags or something was something he'd identify with. He was the original punk. And then scholarship now sees Windam Lewis as the original punk. The Manipian tradition is punk. Now, what's interesting is that when the android meme or the mixed media environment in the global theater by the late 70s is a Manipian environment, that's why the punks were okay for the moment to remind people of the punk tradition, but they were going to be swallowed up. And Johnny Rotten realized this. And the only way to counter the Manipian environment, the very tradition that you're celebrating, Ben, which has become an external environment, is the way Zappa responded to it. Zappa actually had the solution, following in an updated Manipian tradition represented by McLuhan. I mean, Lewis would have been a punk. No, he may not have been that in the 70s, but the part of punk that the punks see in Lewis is not relevant by the late 70s, early 80s. You had to be more comprehensive, and Zappa did it by stretching both sides of the candle, both ends, and running around the middle. He was all over the place. The punks wouldn't go anywhere. They had their territory, and they could not leave that territory. They became what McLuhan called rigid youth. In a tribal society of flexible elders and rigid youth.
But if you criticise punks for that, people will reply and say, no, but there was an interesting art rock side of punk. But in many ways, that's a side of punk that I can't stand. I mean, I was impressed that when Zappa did play a punk record, he chose the UK subs, who are generally contemned by the people who say there's a problem with the limits of punk form and we need to stretch it and so on, who generally, to me, produce a kind of innovated, brittle art rock, which I find doesn't actually move me and solves the problem of the limitations of punk in the wrong way by doing abstractions which have no force. And
yes, they didn't understand that the punk tradition was proud to be wrong. You were proud to be rude, proud to be wrong in all ways. But that still was in the right-wrong dialectic. Zappa was not in any dialectic. And that's the way you have to be to get around the android meme, because the android meme plays up dialectics all over the place and celebrates both sides.
Yeah, but I mean, in philosophical terms,
too pomo for you.
Well, it does, because you see, I don't think there's a way of communicating without using yes and no. This idea that somehow we can have a kind of thing beyond yes and no.
Yes and no within the moment.
Exactly.
Autonomous zone.
That's right. I mean, it's a matter of timing, and timing in both music and philosophy is absolutely the point. And there's a movement in philosophy that thinks that it's all about eternal values, and the values that you're trying to express may well be eternal, but it's the timing of when you say what you want to say which is crucial. And if you haven't got a musician's or a comedian's sense of timing, then as a philosopher I think you'll fail, because it's when you say things which is the relationship to the absolute that you're talking about. And it's this need to understand the relation between the absolute and the specific, which is dialectics. And
yes, that's why on my chart, in a tiny note chart at 5body.com, you'll see the Bob Dobbs quadrant. The movie that represents me is the movie The King of Comedy, with what's that guy, that actor, famous actor?
I'm bad on films.
Yeah, what's the guy, the famous guy in The Godfather, the tough guy?
Marlon Brando.
No, the Robert De Niro.
Oh, him, he's terrible. I can't remember his name, because every movie he's in is absolutely appalling. And
no, you're right, but he did The King of Comedy.
Right.
And have you ever seen The King of Comedy?
I don't want to. You said he was in it. I'm going to avoid it, like the plague.
No, it's before he went bad, 1982. So it's his last good movie. Anyways, the character he played is what we're talking about here.
But I saw a film recently that absolutely has wiped all movies out of my head, apart from this one, and that was Roman Scandals with Eddie Cantor. Have you seen it? It's a fantastic anti-fascist film made in the early 1930s, very aware of Adolf Hitler in Germany, and he goes back in time. He's leading some citizens who've been dehoused by the rich gangsters in their town. It's a kind of socialist movie, and he goes back in time to the Roman Empire, and it's Eddie Cantor with I can't remember I'm so bad on films, and but it's
You're saying that's
Eddie
the last
Cantor
movie you saw?
Yeah, and it's so good. I just can't think of any other movie. All I can see is Eddie Cantor leading this satire on power and the Roman Empire, and of course he ends up as the Caesar's food taster, and there's all sorts of stuff about where the poison is and so on.
Listen to this. Have you seen The World's Greatest Sinner?
No, I've never seen it. I've heard a mysterious sort of 12-minute piece of music by Zappa with cartoon narration, which is The World's Greatest Sinner. But I've never. Tim
Carrey is a interesting character in Kubrick movies and John Cassavetes movies. But Tim Carrey is a huge influence on Zappa, and this is not known. I was telling it to somebody from L.A. recently, and he asked if you knew about it, and I said, no, I don't know if he knows about Tim Carrey. And so you haven't seen the whole movie. Much of Zappa's oeuvre is modeled on The World's Greatest Sinner, so you've got to see it. And
I've always thought it was very basic, because I mean, he's the best, of course, of all the worst is a line from The Torture Never Stops, and so I always thought The World's Greatest Sinner, the idea of redemption through complete evil, the things turning into their opposites, is fundamental to the way Zappa thinks, and so I've always borne in mind. The idea. How long is the film?
It's over an hour and a half, maybe.
Right. Are you aware of the sort of 10-minute, 12-minute cartoon with narration about a world's greatest sinner done by Zappa quite early on, like a summary of that plot?
That he did? Zappa did?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I don't think I've heard that. But here's what I wanted to mention, is that I met Tim Carrey's son with Jerry Fialka back in the late 90s, and we visited his house, and there was a photograph there of Tim Carrey on his premiere night, at Hollywood and Vine or someplace, and in the journalism coverage of it, Jack Nicholson was there. This is in '63, all the young and up-and-coming people in Hollywood later. They were there. It was the hit place to be. And you see Tim Carrey in this photograph with his megaphone addressing the audience and hamming it up. And there's Frank Zappa, the young, 22-year-old Zappa, standing behind him on stage, because he did the soundtrack, watching the audience. And it's the last picture you see of Zappa learning. He's looking and watching Tim Carrey manipulate the audience, and just the way Zappa looks. You've never seen that look. It's the young Zappa learning. You got to see that picture. It should be posted. It is the picture. Zappa disappears after that. He probably gets on Steve Allen around that time, does the bicycle. But Tim Carey is a hidden thing. I don't think you talk about Tim Carey in your book, or anybody does.
No, that's right. I mean, this idea of learning from people right outside your sphere, I think is really interesting. I mean, I always thought that that Zappa learnt a lot from Lord Buckley in terms of surprise and changes of atmosphere. In a Lord Buckley routine, he seems to have the ability to build right up like this, and then whoosh, he's suddenly talking really fast in a completely different zone, and it's disorienting, and it's like a cut, in a mechanical cut in film or in tape. And I thought Zappa honed in on that and adopted it as one of his techniques. So there you are. There's a composer learning from a stand-up comedian and being able to take a technique. So it seems completely natural to watch a film star who you'd have thought in many ways of Zappa as the opposite of Hollywood. That he used R&B and music as a kind of truth, and he had a famous confrontation with John Wayne, for example, where you have the feeling that he's he's excluded from the Hollywood bean feast. He's not doing that, and the whole counterculture is actually made fun of film. I mean, film was couldn't really map the counterculture. You know, when you had a film of, I remember seeing a dreadful film of Bob Hope picking up a teenager. He's driving and he picks up this young chick who's all hippie, and you just had the feeling that old Hollywood couldn't take all this stuff. They didn't know what to make of it. It was something completely new. And
that's where Easy Rider came in, and Jack Nicholson and the other guys.
They were going to do all that stuff for Hollywood. They were going to bridge it. Yeah.
And that comes out the same time as Woodstock happens, and Zappa says Woodstock is a recognition of the youth market by big business. He nailed it right off.
Yeah.
So yes, he was outside and inside. He's watching the previous Marinetti, Tim Carey, create a scene, an event horizon there, a project, object, event, organism, and he's watching and he's going to be doing it. He also learned from Lenny Bruce. He learned from everybody. He learned from John Wayne from that encounter.
Yeah.
That they're all listed. Yeah. 179 names.
Yeah.
But that's the Menippean tradition, updated. You see, the punks, people want identity. You can't find the ID of Windam Lewis or of McLuhan or of Zappa or of us. Maybe you, but they can't find the identity of me. And that is the way you react to the Endor meme.
What do you mean, maybe me? Do you think there are kind of little apprentice Ben Watsons running around, thinking it's stylish to have... my hair keeps changing length, so they can't copy that. Round glasses, the round glasses are hip, and this isn't true.
Oh no, there is. There's Michael. Michael is doing you. He wants to work with you. All his learning is geared to working with Ben. I won't say his last name just in case he doesn't want that out. But here's the other thing. Is that you're not only negative and postmodern and unidentifiable, you have the answer, the solution. You actually go back to being an enlightened person or whatever you call that, those guys who thought they had the answers. We have the answer, Ben, on top of media magic.
But there's a provenance to what we're talking about. In order to explain what we're talking about to people, we have to explain that this set of ideas has a history. It gets passed from one person to another. Not that it couldn't arise without any communication at all. It still stuns me how... the basic argument of my book, Frank Zappa, The Negative Dialectics of Poodle Play, was exploring what for me are extraordinary coincidences between Frank Zappa and someone he never read, Theodore Adorno. And the way I explain that is that if people are living in a similar society, they can react to it, and because the society is beyond them and objective, they can respond in similar ways, which are interesting. Everything is not simply passing the parcel or passing the torch. But at the same time, I think...
Hey, Ben, let me just respond to that point.
Yeah.
I think that the relationship and coincidences you see between Zappa and Adorno is exactly how we explain our relationship. We come from so different worlds, and yet there were coincidences piling up anyways.
Yes, there are.
Lewis.
There are. But there are also similarities that are worth exploring, or common threads. And one of them is this link between early 20th century modernism and McLuhan. between Marinetti's Futurism, Windam Lewis's Vorticism, and McLuhan, of taking that moment of writing a manifesto, declaring that art shouldn't be like this, it should be like this, and trying to affect the media with this idea. That intent, the idea of art as a weapon more than as a solace. That particular idea, we have common reading, common responses, you and me, which allow us to think of things like that. Yeah?
Right, exactly. And when you were walking around the Futurists exhibition and you were puzzling about this, you felt probably the brochures that were handed out, the testaments and explanations, were inadequate. And that's what I feel, that even though we're not experts in Marinettian Futurism, we know enough, and we actually got the message more than the museum curators, and we're actually applying it, which they can't do.
Yeah, well, they smother it. They make everything a contribution to art. I mean, they have this appalling wall with all these signatures on it, and you can look at what art is, and it has Man Ray's signature and Pablo Picasso's signature, and all these, and then you go right up to Damien Hirst, and suddenly you're nothing, and the artists on this wall are everything. They are what art is. It's all away from you. It's all this valuable stuff being curated by them, and you're on. And it's belittling. That's what they are doing to you. But I understood what all those early century modernisms are doing. They're trying to leap out of being merely painters. They can't stand it. And one of the things I really enjoyed was Windam Lewis's ability to completely destroy art movements in a phrase, and he said he wanted an art which has none of the hysteria and noise of Futurism. And immediately Futurism I love Futurism, I love the manifestos, I love what it did, but actually once you say that about the painting, suddenly the painting just shrivels up and you see through it. And he dismissed cubism as a load of peeled artichoke leaves. You take a globe artichoke, you eat it, you throw away all these leaves, all these scalloped leaves, and suddenly all that looks like that. That you can, all this curating of these objects that were produced. I walked around being completely bored with painting, of feeling, I'm really interested in Marinetti going to the different capitals of the world and getting such different responses. In Moscow, they have a completely different take upon what Futurism is, because the Russian economy was so completely different from the Italian economy. They took something completely different from it, but they got excited by what Marinetti was doing live, because he'd go and give lectures. He'd go and talk, and I realised that's what I want to do. I realised that it's confronting people directly and talking about what is the value of all this stuff that everybody's curated. What's the point of it? Why are we doing it? Asking very direct questions is what we are doing and what we should be doing, because at the end of the day, what's the point of all this curating and paying attention to these different movements if we don't understand what the burning point was that all this stuff is like falls off from, like ash from a flame? If you can't see what the flame is, what's the point of stacking up the ash?
Yes, the logical category. I want to read an email sent to me. I think it relates to that point. Karl Marx expounding on Hegel's philosophy of dialectics, and I'm assuming this is a properly quoted couple of paragraphs. Logical category by subject, assigning description to everything comprehended. Here's the quote. Just as by means of abstraction we have transformed everything into a logical category, so one has only to make an abstraction of every characteristic distinctive of different movements to attain movement in its abstract condition. Now put in art movement in here. Think of the printing press in McLuhan's sense, creating the means of abstraction. Purely formal movement, the purely logical formula of movement. If one finds in logical categories the substance of all things, one imagines one is found in the logical formula of movement, the absolute method, which not only explains all things, but also implies the movement of things. What is the abstraction of movement? Movement in abstract condition. What is movement in abstract condition? The purely logical formula of movement, or the movement of pure reason. Wherein does the movement of pure reason consist? Then he emphasized this, the person who sent me it, imposing itself, opposing itself, composing itself. in formulating itself as thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or yet in affirming itself, negating itself, and negating its negation. Then I guess Marx asks, what does this mean? Impersonal reason, having outside itself neither a base on which it can pose itself, nor an object to which it can oppose itself, nor a subject with which it can compose itself, is forced to turn head over heels, imposing itself, opposing itself, and composing itself. Position, opposition, composition. Or to speak Greek, we have thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Is it surprising that everything in the final abstraction, for we have here an abstraction and not an analysis, presents itself as a logical category? Is it surprising that if you let drop little by little all that constitutes the individuality of a house, leaving out first of all the materials of which it is composed, then the form that distinguishes it, you end up with nothing but a body? That if you leave out of account the limits of this body, you soon have nothing but a space. That if finally you leave out of the account the dimension of this space, there's absolutely nothing left but pure quantity, the logical category. Now, do you recognize that paragraph?
Not particularly, actually. I mean, I've always avoided thesis, antithesis, synthesis as a kind of a pat description of what the dialectic is. So I might need to call upon Esther. She'd probably recognise it, but I don't.
It says here. It says the poverty of philosophy, chapter 2, part 1, first observation.
Let me have a look at it in situ.
The interesting thing is this. The person is asking me if Karl Marx is expressing what I call the mystery landscape, which is where we are technologically right now, with the obsolescence of the chip landscape. And I don't think so, it is, but I was curious in your expertise on this, because isn't this the category is what the museum does? Absolutely.
It's the abstraction. I mean, Marx is satirizing it. He's complaining about it. He's saying that this reduction of everything to abstractions it seems to me to be absolutely dissing thesis, antithesis, synthesis as a kind of holy trinity of abstraction you can apply to anything and everything, and it's meaningless. And he's casting around for abstractions which might be determinate, which might emerge from the real society that he's looking at.
Does he find any?
Yes, capital, labour.
Oh, okay. The environment. The ground that caused the categorization tendency.
Yeah, I mean, Marx is the plunging of philosophy into the real situation that we're in. And so he thought that Hegel was a fantastic representation of the way that capital cannot stand a limit, is continually seeking new ways of making profit, but that Hegel couldn't recognize that as capital, saw it as spirit. And
that's exactly what McLuhan says. McLuhan agrees with Karl Marx regarding Hegel.
Yeah, well, Marx's ideas on Hegel have kind of permeated out and become kind of received wisdom by all sorts of people who don't think of themselves as Marxists. But what I've found in trying to deal with the area of music and the avant-garde of people seeking to express themselves in society is that I've tried to do what Marx did, which is to ground what their frustrations are and what their desires are in determinate observations about one's life and what we're all trying to do. And what I've found is that a lot of artists are completely hostile to this and find it reductive and grubbying and repulsive to mention that when they're making a CD, they're taking it to market, that they're promoting it and seeking to sell it. And they think that I'm proposing some kind of way of doing it which is completely different. Well, I'm interested in people who try different things because it illustrates the problem. But I don't think, short of revolution, we're going to be able to produce music in different ways. And one of the things that I like about Zappa, and it's interesting to look at Zappa, is that he didn't reject capitalist means of production of his music, but he never lied about what he was doing. He was always very clear about, he didn't say, oh, well, I don't produce product. I'm producing a new kind of nice thing, which is avoiding the problems of capitalism. You know, that he said, I wanted Freak Out to be a hit, you know?
That's right. He says in an interview in the mid-'70s in Downbeat or somewheres that he tells people how to get their albums and new works distributed. It's a total practical advice on how to get into the market.
But he does this with a
irony.
There's something there's something going on in it, which is not blinding you to what that effect is, which is why I had such a positive response to it.
Warning.
Whereas
it was a warning.
So many of the so-called...
The Downbeat interview was a warning to the kids who wanted to become musicians in different fields, a warning of the industrial factors. I mean, no one else in John Coltrane didn't tell anybody that, you know.
Yeah.
Roland Kirk didn't tell him. He Zappa, right in the middle of this aesthetic magazine, he talks about the practical dirt and crime of the business. Carry on what you were saying.
Yeah. And this leads on to a kind of... I don't know, you're less of an intolerant, cantankerous person than me, but for me, once that has been explained to me, I find it very difficult to tolerate those people who aspire to some kind of non-commercial or avant cachet, whilst actually honing what they're doing to a certain niche market.
Let me say that. My model is apply the 5 bodies: the chemical body, astral body, chip body, TV body, and mystery body. And what you have is the what you're calling artists who want to get their product out there immediately, and they come out of the graduate schools in New York. Before the crash, they were coming out of the master's classes and immediately becoming celebrated within the huge abundance of cash in New York. So these are people whose chemical body wants to make art so they can have time to enjoy their chip body and TV body. They want time, and they want to make money as much as possible. So therefore, the art activity limited to the chemical body is not avant-garde anymore. We have to comprehend the 4 bodies and juggle them. That's the problem here. I don't know if I ever got to say this before on the show, the 4-body model. That's what I'm thinking of, Ben, the last 21 shows, while you're complaining about the avant-garde compromise or the Pomo compromise. Look at it. You saw Marinetti. Marinetti had a physical body. He came in, and he took on the beginning of the tactile body that was coming in with movies, telephone, and radio, and he had a chemical body response. But the chemical body response today is futile. And a normal chemical body, even a hip artist in a school at Slade or something, knows they must get their money as soon as possible so they can get into the other bodies and have time to work on them. It's not just a matter of getting money to get a mortgage and kids. It's you've got to engage your bodies. Now, you react to that by sort of playing down your chip body and TV body consumption. You don't do much of it.
Yeah, I mean, what I noticed, though, is that I remember Esther bought me a kid's book done by Keith Haring. You know Keith Haring, who does the outlines of people and so on.
Yeah.
And it was a very bad book for kids. It was because I'm kind of very aware of this, having 2 children, of opening books and is there something logical for their eye to look at? Is there something exciting if you turn the page? Does this work? And I'm quite amazed by how intricate and beautifully crafted the really good kids' books are. There are whole worlds in there, and they work, because if the kid asks a question about this, it leads on to something which tells you more, and you can explain it. They manage to put the whole world, fold the whole world in there properly, so that if you inquire into it, you can learn. And Keith Haring had done a book which just failed at the first instance, that every page was jarring, it didn't develop. And the idea of using art to kind of make your pile and make your fame so that you can then use it for other things seems to me completely arse about tip, and nearly always produces disasters. And it's the thing that Guy Debord and the Situationists criticise, where somebody makes it as a football and immediately they start producing perfumes, and then they're a novelist, and then they're a TV personality. For me, these are all the enemy, these people who find a position in the spectacle and then parlay it into another position, and for me they do nothing particularly well, and they are the system that clogs up cultural life so that you can't see anything good, and you can't work your way through it. And that the people I like are more like Bruce Bickford, who can spend 20 years making a 20-minute movie. I thought one of the things I admired about Frank is that he had a certain position in the spectacle. He was quite famous, and yet he was perpetually pointing at art that no one had heard of, done by people who had worked out that for art to work, it needs every single detail needs to be put on purpose and be worth your investigation, worth your time. And he was always pointing to them and encouraging you to go and look at them or to hear them. And in that sense, I still believe in art as a criticism of mass media. I'm not talking about art as a system of making money so you have time to become one of these bad novelists or sort of awful chefs, or these kind of things that once you're in the spectacle you can become. I'm talking about art as a criticism of mass media by saying that there is still work on detail that may be achieved by people that people will learn from, and that this stuff finally is the only stuff that makes culture, and that this network of actual culture is obscured by so much dross. Now, I think we can burn away the dross and find what this actual network is. This network also happens to include everybody.
That's right. And everybody more and more has the same grievance as you've just expressed. But once you understand the model of the four bodies and what drives people to end up inevitably in that Baroque spiraling of niche marketing and capitalizing on your icon, once you understand why that's happening, that's a revolutionary view. That's revolutionary to get that perspective. What is actually revolutionary, David, is to understand me.
Yeah.
And to adopt that position. And that's hard to do, but that it's not producing, it's understanding the process, which is what McLuhan said. So you can't escape this media thing, but you can have understanding. And now what is understanding consistent of? It includes all that you're an expert on, including your expertise in finding ignorance and celebrating it, spontaneous ignorance. I don't mean that negatively. We should unionize ignorance as a union.
Absolutely. I mean, ignorance is frequently ignorance of what everybody knows is a thing which frees you for your own purposes, and is a residue of something that hasn't been, in Adorno's terms, dominated by the concept or abstracted away in Marx's terms in that quote you were doing earlier. And
the
that's
logical categories take on a life of their own.
And this is the same as the perverse or the incomprehensible in Frank Zappa. I always think of the song he wrote for Captain Beefheart for Bongo Fury, which is about things so obscure that various people have worked out that it was Mexican cheap films that they both were, but actually spelling it all out kind of doesn't really explain why it's so satisfying to hear a Mexican rubber goods mask. When Beefheart says that, the specific teenage obsession which allowed them to get so het up about such a funny detail is the protest against the way the instant comprehensibility and the self-evidence of attraction and wealth which exists in a TV chef or those kind of spectacular icons.
Right. The way you walked around, the frustration you felt in the exhibit, and thinking and responding it totally differently from anybody else in your own disgust and excitement, that condition of frustration and ambiguity is the artistic avant-garde.
Yeah, but the artistic avant-garde is isolated and subjective. It's imaginary dreams in the imaginary dreamer. And I suppose my surrealist democracy is that everybody has these impulses, and it's a matter of coordinating them and organising them, which is the revolution, that it's actually bringing them to consciousness and putting them in touch with each other, which is explosive.
Yes, and that is really hard to do because there's always others who hear it, because we're all connected and everybody hears about everything. They will immediately infiltrate you. If the group, as May Brussel used to say, gets bigger than 5 people, you've been infiltrated.
Absolutely, but I've found it, I mean, I flip-flop between deciding it's failure and deciding it's real success in the way you're explaining it. I've never found it very difficult to slough off a claim and You know, I find it quite strange reading situationist texts, which are all about, the bourgeoisie are coming to recuperate you. They're going to buy up your pictures, and I don't feel these people hunting me down. I feel completely ignored, frustrated, and lonely.
And you don't worry about that.
No, it upsets me. I mean, I like it if I'm going to be recuperated and given lots of money. I mean, I'm waiting for the phone to ring. I'm completely into selling out. It just doesn't seem to happen to me. You know, I have no moral objection to selling out, and I'm very suspicious of people who have moral objections to selling out, who insist to you that they didn't take the money. I think they're lying.
Yes, and the reason you are not being sought after by the Android meme is that you sincerely experience it. It knows its enemy.
Yeah.
You are its enemy, and you would use it to get in there and bug it.
Well, that's it. I mean, one does want to turn around and say what you think of the chairperson at the panel you've been invited to be on. Otherwise, you kind of feel you're going through some straining thing, which I think actually gives you ulcers and finally gives you cancer.
That's right. And the Android meme, this is proof that the Android meme is a living organism that has ESP, and it knows who to avoid, and it knows who to celebrate.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at a recent one. Examples: Douglas Rushkoff, the McLuhan of your generation or a little younger, and he was on Stephen Colbert and totally slayed by the Android meme. He didn't know how to deal with it. I know that if you went on there, you might do okay. You might not do as well as me, but you'd have the right, sincere gene.
That moment of embarrassment. I remember thinking that the novelist Ian Sinclair might become one of those. One of his first appearances on TV, when he became more and more successful, actually had us blushing as we watched. There was something going on that was indescribably wrong for television. But he seems to have managed to straighten himself up now and managed to become quite dull and acceptable. But this way of understanding what media figures are doing is interesting, and it's a light.
And you learned. This is the thing, Ben. You learned from Zappa. You learned what the message was by Zappa's example. You're saying Ian did okay the first time on TV?
Well, because he did so badly in a way, yeah. But he's
you like that?
Yeah, because he was an interruption to the flow of we all understand everything, and here's a novelist. We know what a novelist is, even though Samuel Beckett actually killed the novel. That incomprehension was discomforted. I think now he's
more conscious.
He's produced a kind of. He's decided that he's boring himself and he's boring everybody, and this is an okay place to be. I mean, it's a bit sad. I'm a bit sad about Ian Sinclair and his success and boringness, and I think he is too. And the melancholy comes out in the books. But you're quite right. It's learning. It's learning from Zappa what these
what the problem was.
What the problem is.
How Frank kind of solved it within his time.
Yeah, and that this affects everybody, and that art is not some immune area. And this is what I objected to about the new art history being taught in Leeds. It was actually training curators of art to be, and therefore, however Marxist it pretended to be, it never understood that you could learn from somebody completely outside art, from somebody like Frank Zappa, about what kind of society you're inserting art into, that art is not an autonomous zone, that it is absolutely about publicity and money. And unless you understand publicity and money, and to understand that, you have to understand the people with integrity who fought with the beast, whether it's Frank Zappa or Jimi Hendrix or whoever you pick as someone that you believe in.
Well, that raises a point. I don't know if I've ever heard you talk about this. What do you make of Bob Dylan and what he's doing?
Bob Dylan I find extraordinarily disappointing every time I trip over him. I can't deny the voice. I don't find if I write down the lyrics that they are the high poetry they're meant to be. I find them pretty banal. But the voice is absolutely undeniable. He had something amazing in singing. I find his rewriting of history since the 60s of how he never really meant all those left-wing things quite disgusting. But then he got involved with Scorsese, who's another of your De Niro people, and that area seems to me a very bad area of mass culture.
So you would agree with Frank Zappa sort of tossing him off in '82 when he showed up at his doorstep?
Absolutely, and that idea of contracting out the rhythm to Giorgio Moroder and playing guitar and singing over the top was absolutely correct. You know, that Bob Dylan should recognise the way in which the industrialisation of culture has created this machinic horror. And it was left to Leonard Cohen to actually take up that advice, and Leonard Cohen carried it out quite well, I thought.
So you, of that folky tradition, you prefer Leonard Cohen over
Well, no,
Dylan.
simply because he adopted, went and worked with Giorgio Moroder and faced disco, which Bob Dylan was incapable of doing.
That's right. And now Leonard Cohen...
You've got 20 seconds to wrap this up, Bob.
Well, Leonard Cohen, with Marsh McLuhan, named the first Canadian communication satellite. So Cohen learned from McLuhan.
But, Bob, you would say that because you're a Canadian. I'm looking forward...
Not.
You're not?
I was born in Paris.
Esther,
I was born in Paris.
You're a Parisian. That's even better. Okay, more news, more information about Bob will be revealed next week. Thanks for listening, everybody. Goodbye.